The desert wind dragged sand through the ruined outskirts of, whispering across shattered glass and burned out Humvees like a warning no one could hear. The city looked dead from above, collapsed buildings, empty streets, blackened walls. But Lieutenant Eve Carter knew better. Wars never slept. They just learned how to breathe quietly. She lay flat against the broken spine of a collapsed minaret, her body molded into the rubble as if she'd grown there. 6 hours without moving. 6 hours without water. Her cheek pressed against warm stone, her pulse slow and deliberate. Every muscle in her body screamed to shift, to blink harder, to exist, but she had all. Below her, a Marine patrol advanced in tight formation, boots crunching softly over debris. Eve tracked them through her scope, not as targets but as responsibility. If she failed tonight, some of those men wouldn't make it home. Her rifle, custom-built from years of use, rested steady in her hands. The scope drifted across rooftops, windows, alley mouths. She wasn't looking for movement. Movement lied. She was looking for patterns. The intel packet replayed in her mind, unwanted but persistent. Target: Insurgent Commander. Call sign: the Falcon. Status: untouched, unseen, untouchable. Dozens of operations had tried and failed to eliminate him. Drone strikes hit empty buildings. Raids kicked down doors that had been abandoned hours earlier. Snipers never even caught a silhouette. That was why Command had hesitated before giving the order. One sniper, no spotter, no team, no air support. Alone. Eve remembered the pause on the radio when the mission parameters were read. The unspoken question: was this desperation or trust? She adjusted her breathing, slowing it until the world narrowed to a tunnel of glass and crosshairs. Her finger rested outside the trigger guard, patient. She had learned long ago that impatience killed faster than bullets. A flash of memory intruded, her first deployment. A male officer joking that she'd be safer guarding radios. Another telling her she was too calm for combat, as if calm were weakness. Calm was survival. The wind shifted. Eve noticed it immediately, not by sound but by feel. Heat shimmered differently along a distant rooftop, too controlled, too deliberate. Her scope froze. There, 3 buildings east, a shadow where there shouldn't be one, not a person, not movement. Absence. Someone had cleared that rooftop recently. No debris, no birds, no laundry lines flapping like the others. Her heartbeat ticked once, twice. She checked angles, range, wind, elevation. Everything lined up too cleanly, and that alone set her nerves on edge. The Falcon was known for one thing above all else. He never repeated himself. A sudden crack echoed in the distance, not a shot, but a door slamming somewhere far off. The Marines below stiffened, weapons rising. Eve followed their line of sight, then snapped back to the rooftop. The shadow was gone. Her jaw tightened. That wasn't evasion, that was confirmation. Her radio remained silent, too silent. She resisted the urge to check in. Radio discipline mattered more now than ever. Slowly she adjusted her position, redistributing weight grain by grain. Sweat trickled down her spine despite the cooling air. She ignored it. Then she saw it. A faint glint, no more than a blink, where the shadow had been. Glass. Optics. Eve's finger slid to the trigger. And for the first time since the mission began, a thought cut through her calm like a blade. He knows I'm here. The city seemed to hold its breath with her. Because somewhere out there, another sniper had just found his mark. And the hunt had officially begun. Command hadn't wanted to send Carter by herself. That truth lingered in the pauses between radio transmissions, in the way her orders had been worded too carefully, as if the officers feared saying them out loud would make the risk real. The battlefield doctrine was clear. Snipers worked in pairs. Shooter and spotter. One mind behind the scope, one watching the world. But doctrine didn't account for the Falcon. Eve had learned his history long before she ever set foot in. Former military, Western-trained, fluent in English, Arabic, and tactics that mirrored American playbooks almost perfectly. He studied U.S. operations the way scholars studied scripture, patiently, obsessively, looking for faith to exploit. Teams failed against him, every time. 2 snipers meant 2 heat signatures, 2 sets of tracks, 2 heartbeats to listen for. The Falcon didn't attack force, he waited for patterns, then broke them. Eve was different. She didn't fit patterns easily. Back at camp weeks earlier, she'd stood in a windowless briefing room while satellite images flickered across the wall. Buildings circled in red, dates crossed out, casualty counts quietly updated. "This is where he should been," an analyst said, "and here and here." Eve had studied the images without speaking. Everyone expected her to ask questions, to request assets, to negotiate conditions. Instead, she'd pointed to an uncircled block on the map. "Why hasn't anyone searched this area?" The room had gone quiet. "That sector's a dead zone," someone replied. "No activity, no intel." "Exactly," Eve had said. That was when the decision had been made. Alone, she was a variable the Falcon couldn't predict. No chatter between teammates, no synchronized movement, just one ghost against another. Still, the resistance hadn't stopped. "You're exposed without a spotter," one officer had argued. Eve met his eyes, so is he. Now, hours later, crouched in rubble with the city breathing around her, she understood the weight of that choice more clearly than ever. She shifted slowly, careful not to disturb the dust pattern she'd memorized. The glint she'd seen earlier replayed in her mind over and over. Not panic, analysis. The Falcon hadn't fired. That mattered. If he'd wanted her dead, the shot would come already. Instead, he'd revealed just enough to let her know she was no longer alone in the hunt. A challenge. Her radio crackled faintly, then died. Eve frowned, not static, controlled interruption. Someone was bleeding her signal, testing reach and reaction time. She powered it down completely. Silence rushed in, thick and heavy. The Marines below had halted, kneeling behind cover. They were waiting for orders that hadn't come yet. Eve tracked their perimeter, calculating how far she could let this duel stretch before innocent lives were pulled into it. That was the danger with the Falcon. He used soldiers like terrain. A memory surfaced uninvited, another city, another war. Eve lying belly down in freezing mud, watching a man walk away because the shot wasn't clean. The radio afterward, the shouting, the accusation that she'd hesitated. She hadn't hesitated. She'd chosen. That choice had saved civilians. It had also earned her a reputation, effective but difficult. Command trusted her results, even if they didn't always understand her methods. The wind shifted again. Eve felt it this time against her cheek, bringing with it the smell of burning plastic and something sharper, freshly disturbed concrete. Close. Too close. She scanned lower rooftops now, not the skyline. The Falcon wouldn't mirror her position. He'd offset, force vertical confusion. Her scope passed over a stairwell opening and stopped. A boot print. Not old, edges crisp. Heel turned outward slightly, as if the wearer favored one leg. Eve's pulse slowed further. She adjusted her position, aligning angles, mentally sketching his likely route. Every instinct told her the same thing. He wasn't retreating. He was closing distance. Her finger rested against the trigger again, but she didn't fire. Because somewhere in the dark, the Falcon was making the same calculation and deciding whether tonight ended with one body. Or two, the shot broke the night without warning. It wasn't loud, not by battlefield standards, but it was sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence that had settled over the district. A single crack, precise and final. The man in the street never heard it. One moment he was stepping out from behind a burned sedan, rifle angled low, scanning for Marines. The next, his body folded as if the ground had been yanked out from under him. His weapon clattered across the pavement, spinning once before coming to rest. Below, the Marine patrol froze. Eve was already cycling the bolt. Her scope stayed fixed on the fallen figure, not in triumph but verification. No movement, no twitch. The shot had been clean, entry just beneath the helmet line, exit invisible from this distance. She exhaled slowly. That kill wasn't personal, it was positioning. The man hadn't been the Falcon. Eve had known that the moment she saw him step into the open so casually. The Falcon didn't expose himself. He sent others to test the water, to measure response time and firing angles. Bait. The Marines shouted commands, dragging the body toward cover. Their radios erupted. Questions, warnings, requests for overwatch. Eve didn't respond. She was listening. And then she heard it. A faint hiss in her earpiece, controlled, intentional, followed by a voice that didn't belong on her channel. "You shoot clean," the voice said calmly. No accent, no strain, almost conversational. Very clean. Eve's blood went cold. Her fingers tightened around the rifle as she scanned instinctively, heart rate ticking up for the first time that night. He shouldn't have been able to access that frequency. It was encrypted, rotated daily. Unless. "But you shoot alone," the voice continued almost kindly. "That makes you brave or careless." Eve rolled sideways without hesitation, abandoning the perfect nest she'd spent hours building. The instant she moved, a round slammed into the stone where her head had been, pulverizing concrete into her face. She felt the impact through the rubble, a shockwave that rattled her teeth. He was already on me. Dust filled her lungs as she slid behind a low wall, coughing silently, forcing herself to stay still. Her heart hammered now, but her hands remained steady. Panic wasted oxygen. She peeked through a gap in the rubble. Nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement, just darkness and ruined buildings. The voice returned, closer now, not physically but psychologically. "You know why I like hunting snipers," he said, "because they think stillness makes them invisible." Eve clenched her jaw. She powered her radio off completely and ripped the earpiece free. He'd gotten what he wanted: reaction, confirmation, elevation. She crawled backward inch by inch, keeping low, using shadows and broken geometry to mask her movement. Every scrape of gear sounded deafening in her head. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Not at her. A Marine screamed. Eve's breath caught as she spotted one of the patrolmen drop to a knee, clutching his shoulder, blood darkening his sleeve. The Falcon had shifted focus effortlessly, reminding her what failure would cost. "He's forcing me to move," she realized. And worse, he was showing her he could kill whenever he wanted. She needed to break contact, reset the board, change the rules. Eve slid into a drainage gap between buildings, disappearing into shadow just as another round cracked overhead. Stone chips rained down where she'd been seconds earlier. She pressed herself flat, counting her breaths, mapping escape routes in her head. This wasn't Overwatch anymore. This wasn't even pursuit. It was a message. The Falcon wasn't just hunting Marines. He was hunting her. And as Eve melted into the ruins of, one brutal truth settled in her chest with undeniable weight. She had taken the first body. But the war for the second one had only just begun. Night fell like a curtain over the shattered streets of, folding the city into jagged shadows and whispered dangers. Eve's boots made no sound as she moved through alleyways littered with rubble, scorched cars, and the hollow shells of buildings. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. She was a ghost, and the city was her hunting ground. But there was another ghost, one that knew every move she made before she made it. Eve's instincts screamed at her. This was no longer a mission. It was a test, a duel. The Falcon wasn't just skilled, he was predictive, almost omniscient. The subtle traces he left weren't mistakes, they were bait. Every shift in dust, every footprint, every glint in a shattered window was meant to lure her into a choice. Her scope had revealed the first clue, a faint reflection on a roof across the street. Nothing solid, just a hint of a lens catching the moonlight. She froze, letting her senses absorb the city. The Marines below had taken cover, still unaware of just how close the danger had gotten. She crept past the ruins of a collapsed market, mapping exits in her head. Every alley had been tampered with, small debris subtly displaced, footprints in the sand erased and reset. Eve realized with chilling clarity he was not following. He was guiding her. Her radio crackled faintly, just enough to rattle her. "You should brought a friend," said the Falcon, calm, deliberate. "Even legends get tired." Eve pressed herself against a fractured wall, heart pounding. The sound wasn't static, it was deliberate. Intimidation, probing, the kind of psychological precision that left no margin for error. She scanned the shadows across the street. Nothing moved. Then, for a heartbeat, the glint returned, subtle, fleeting, almost teasing. Her mind raced through every sniper scenario she had drilled for years, every calculation, every probability. The Falcon was close, too close. She knew it because he left no trace of hesitation. Every micro-movement in the environment, the subtle displacement of a tarp, the shadow under a crumbling ledge, the smell of burned rubber carried on the wind, screamed predator. Her hands tightened around her rifle, but she didn't fire. He wanted that. He wanted her to react, to break the invisible tension with a single mistake. The wind shifted again, carrying dust across her cheek. Her eyes adjusted. Across the street, a window frame shifted slightly, just a hairline crack. That was enough. Enough to tell her the game had escalated. She paused, crouched, her mind analyzing escape vectors, shooting lanes, enemy behavior. Every instinct whispered the same warning. He wasn't just ahead. He was waiting for her to make the first move. Eve's breath slowed to a controlled rhythm. One misstep and it could end here. Not just her mission, but the Marines still moving blindly below, counting on her. She moved again, silently, feeling the city around her like a chessboard. Every corner was a square, every shadow a piece, and the Falcon was the player who always saw the board first. As she slipped into a half-collapsed apartment, she glanced back across the street. For a moment, the city seemed still, holding its breath. And then she realized the rooftop she had just passed was empty, but the ladder leading to it was. Her stomach sank. He had set the trap, and she had just walked straight into it. She pressed herself into the dark, pulling the rifle, finger brushing the trigger. Outside, the city whispered of movement, and in that whisper, Eve understood the truth. He wanted her to shoot first. And in a duel where patience was a weapon, even a second's hesitation could be fatal. Eve Carter didn't panic. That wasn't her way. The Falcon had revealed his hand too clearly. The subtle misplacements, the controlled disturbances, the glinting optics. He thought he had her cornered. But Eve had spent years in shadows longer than anyone she knew, learning the art of disappearing without leaving a footprint. She vanished. To him, it looked like retreat. No shots fired, no movement, just silence. That silence became her weapon. Eve abandoned the half-collapsed apartment, sliding through a narrow gap between buildings that no one had thought to check. Her rifle was still in her hands, but she wrapped it carefully in torn cloth to silence even the faintest scrape. Every creak of her gear, every brush against rubble, was measured, deliberate. She paused briefly in a drainage tunnel she had scouted earlier. Its damp walls smelled of decay and dust. Her cut from earlier bled slightly onto her sleeve, an improvised lure she smeared across the floor to simulate injury. The Falcon would see it. He always noticed the details. Outside, the city lay quiet, too quiet. She could almost hear him thinking. Eve counted steps in her head, measured the timing of patrols, and ran through worst-case scenarios like a machine. Then she waited. Patience was her ally. Moments later, he appeared. The falcon moved with the precision of a predator, following the path she had chosen for him, circling the abandoned apartment as if he could read the map she'd drawn in her head. His movements were careful, calculating, but she could see it. He believed he had the advantage. He thought she was cornered. Eve pressed herself flat against the shadows, waiting. Every muscle in her body screamed to remain still, but her mind worked frenetically. This was it. This was the trap. The falcon spotted her abandoned rifle first. A small smile flickered across his face. He crouched slightly, moving closer, inspecting what he assumed was evidence of her position. Too easy, he thought. And then Eve emerged. Not from above, not with a scope trained across the street. She came from behind him, a suppressed pistol pressed to his spine. "Drop it," she whispered, voice low and steady. No hesitation. He laughed softly, calm, controlled, almost impressed. "Clever," he said, "but you forget one thing." A faint click, almost imperceptible. Eve froze. Her instincts screamed as her mind processed the sound. It wasn't a weapon, at least not the kind she thought. A small detonator in his hand, nearly invisible in the dim moonlight. He had planned for this, as he always did. The world exploded. Concrete and glass erupted around her, hurling shards like knives. Heat singed her hair, dust and smoke filled her lungs, and the world became a chaotic blur. Eve slammed herself against the ground, instinctively curling into a protective shell. Her pistol skidded out of reach, but she wasn't dead. She wasn't even incapacitated. Coughing, ears ringing, eyes stinging, she struggled to her feet. The falcon was moving, fast, precise, taking advantage of the chaos to escape into shadows she had thought were safe. Pain lanced through her shoulder. Her vision blurred. Dust and blood coated her face, but Eve Carter was nothing if not relentless. She snatched up her abandoned rifle. The scope was cracked, the barrel scorched, but it could still fire. One shot, one chance, that was all she needed. Her mind slowed, calculated, focused. The falcon had taught her something without a word. Even the cleverest hunters left patterns. Even the best predators could be anticipated. She spotted him, mid-stride, heading for the crumbled remains of a building 2 blocks ahead. Eve drew a breath, held it, and prepared. Because this hunt, her hunt, was far from over. And when she fired next, someone would fall. Whether it was the falcon or herself, only one would walk away. Eve Carter pressed the cracked rifle against her shoulder, ignoring the searing pain in her arm and shoulder. The world was chaos around her, smoke coiling from blown-out walls, sparks from shattered electrical lines, and dust thick enough to choke. Every step she'd taken in this city, every calculation she'd made, had led to this moment. The falcon was ahead, moving fast, shadows stretching and breaking under the flickering light of fires scattered through the ruins. Her vision blurred, her ears rang. Adrenaline pounded through her veins, drowning out fear. The falcon was good, better than anyone she'd hunted, but he was human. And humans, no matter how clever, always left traces. She checked the range, 1,000 yards, no spotter, no laser rangefinder, no support, nothing but instinct, calculation, and her own heartbeat. Her mind slowed, cutting through the chaos. Wind, check, distance, check, moving target, calculated, obstructions, noted, breath held. The falcon darted behind a low wall of debris, thinking he had secured cover. Eve exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. Time seemed to stretch. The bullet cut through smoke, heat shimmer, and the shifting air above the rubble. Every second felt like an eternity. Marines below paused, frozen mid-step, ears straining for the unmistakable crack of a sniper's kill. And then the falcon faltered. He had misjudged one factor, Eve Carter's instinct. The round struck true mid-stride. He stumbled, caught in the open for just a heartbeat before collapsing behind the debris. His weapon clattered, spinning uselessly. The chaos froze around him for an instant, as though the city itself held its breath. Eve lowered the rifle slowly, letting herself process the moment. She was alive. He was down. The impossible had happened. The radio erupted suddenly, voices overlapping, filled with shock and confusion. Target down. Confirm who took the shot. Where is the sniper? Eve didn't respond. She didn't need to. No one could know, no one could see. She had done what was impossible, alone. Her shoulder burned, every movement a reminder of the explosion, the chaos, the close calls. She pressed herself flat behind the rubble, listening. The city was quiet again, but Eve knew better. Quiet was dangerous. Quiet meant opportunity. She watched the body carefully. Not relief, not triumph, just observation. The Falcon hadn't been careless. He had made a mistake because Eve had anticipated his patterns. It was precision, yes, but also instinct. Years of waiting, watching, learning the rhythm of combat had led to this shot that should have missed. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, but she stayed low. The Marines were moving cautiously now, scanning the streets. They would never know who changed the entire operation with a single bullet. And Eve realized something else, a truth heavier than victory. This war was bigger than one duel. One predator defeated another, but the battlefield was still alive. The Falcon had been only one part of a greater web. Others would follow his methods, his discipline, his deadly patience. She exhaled slowly, lowering her rifle. The adrenaline that had sharpened her mind was fading into exhaustion. The battle was won tonight. The war was far from over. Eve Carter stood alone in the shadows, blood and dust coating her uniform, the city stretching around her like a graveyard of silent witnesses. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, private acknowledgement. She had survived the impossible. But she also knew, deep in her bones, that survival was only part of the cost, and that the real hunt had only just begun. The first reports came at dawn. Marines whispered in hushed tones about the impossible shot, about a single sniper who had felled the Falcon from nearly 1,000 yards. Recon units confirmed it. Insurgent activity in the sector plummeted. Supply lines reopened. Civilians cautiously returned to streets once thick with danger. Official reports, however, told a different story. Coordinated strike, they read. Combined efforts from multiple units. No mention of Eve Carter. Her name didn't appear in briefings, reports, or even the whispers passed between officers. She walked through the base quietly, uniform dirty, hair streaked with blood and soot. Her rifle was cleaned, repacked, and stored. No medals, no fanfare. Just another day in the long line of days she had survived. Only one officer stopped her before she left the operations center. Colonel, a grizzled man who had seen far too many soldiers lost to wars he hadn't been able to prevent, leaned back in his chair. His eyes were sharp, tired, and full of unspoken understanding. "You changed the entire campaign," he said, voice low. "Why didn't you call for backup? Why didn't you report it?" Eve paused, wiping grime from her sleeve. Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Because he would vanish," she said simply. "Some fights only end when one person refuses to blink." Didn't argue. He only nodded, as if acknowledging a truth he had long understood but could rarely admit. As she boarded the transport plane, leaving the city behind, Eve allowed herself a brief glance out the window. Stretched below her, a shattered skeleton of buildings and streets. She had been the unseen hand, the ghost no one claimed. But even as she exhaled in the brief relief of altitude, new intelligence landed in her inbox. Satellite images, intercepted communications, scattered reports. The Falcon had never operated alone. Her stomach tightened. He was only one node in a network. Others were still out there. Others trained, patient, intelligent. The nightmare she had faced could repeat, multiply, and evolve. Eve's hand hovered over her rifle in its secure case, almost instinctively. She didn't panic. She didn't flinch. She simply noted the reality and prepared. The battlefield didn't care about recognition. It didn't care about medals or names. It cared about survival, calculation, and timing. And Eve had spent her life becoming a master of all three. As the plane ascended, the sun rising over the horizon, she thought of the soldiers below, the civilians who had survived, and the insurgents who would no longer feel invincible. One shot had changed a city. One hunter had outwitted another. But the war didn't care about singular victories. Somewhere out there, others were learning, others were watching, others were preparing. Eve Carter didn't relax. She never did. She folded her gear quietly, cleaned her hands of blood and dust, and let the silence stretch. The falcon was down, but the web remained. The fight, the hunt, the relentless pursuit of survival, it wasn't over. And Eve understood with crystal clarity that her story, the story of the sniper who changed the war alone, was only just beginning. Because legends didn't retire quietly, they waited. And somewhere in the shadows beyond her sight, a new hunt was already forming. Years later, the story of some impossible shot had become the stuff of whispered legend among snipers and special operations units. In classrooms, on online forums, in debriefings where the instructors spoke in hushed tones, they debated wind calculations, distance, probability. And every time, someone would mention her name quietly. Or rather, try not to. Eve Carter never corrected them. She lived in a quiet house miles from any military base, surrounded by trees rather than ruins, roads rather than alleyways. No medals adorned her walls, no press releases carried her name. The world had moved on, unaware that a single hunter had once reshaped the course of a war. And yet Eve remained vigilant. Old habits die hard. She woke early, ran miles before dawn, scanning rooftops, noting movement. The instincts honed in the deserts of Iraq, the ruined streets of still guided her every step. Sometimes at night she would dream of the flash on the rooftop, of the leading her into the trap, of the precise moment the shot left her rifle, cutting through heat and chaos to hit the impossible mark, of the falcon, the predator she had outwitted, not permanently, but long enough to shift the tides. Even in dreams, she could feel the weight of him, the tension of the hunt, the silent intelligence that seemed to anticipate every move. And she knew, instinctively, that it wasn't over. Legends, she understood, didn't retire. And neither did predators. Somewhere someone was watching, waiting, learning. The falcon had been only the beginning. His network, his disciples, those who trained in silence and shadow, were still out there, and Eve Carter would be ready. She had learned long ago that recognition and fame were luxuries for those who could afford to let their guard down. She had no intention of such indulgence. Her satisfaction came in mastery, in control, in survival against odds that would have broken others. Her phone buzzed, an encrypted alert from former contacts in intelligence. A small cluster of chatter in a distant country. Nothing immediate, nothing urgent. Just enough to remind her. The world still moved in patterns she could predict, and others moved within patterns she needed to anticipate. Eve cleaned her rifle methodically like a ritual. Each movement precise, deliberate, a meditation in preparation. Outside, the world was calm, ordinary. Cars drove down empty streets, children played in parks. Peace for now. She allowed herself a small smile. Quiet, private. For one fraction of a second, she remembered the weight of the first kill, the chaos of the explosion, the impossible flight of the bullet. And then she placed the rifle carefully on its stand and walked to the window. She watched the horizon, where rooftops met sky, and shadows stretched across ordinary streets. Somewhere out there, someone remembered the name Eve Carter. Somewhere, someone understood the lesson. A single hunter, alone, could change everything. But Eve wasn't seeking recognition. She was seeking readiness. And she always would be. Because legends don't fade, they wait. They wait for the next hunt. And somewhere in the shadows beyond vision, The world knew she was still out there, silent, patient, and unblinking. Eve Carter, the ghost sniper, the woman who had changed the course of war with a single hunt, still walked among the living, and everyone who knew the truth understood. When she walks, the world shifts, even if no one notices. The legend wasn't over. It had never been over. It had only begun.